times. So I really like to focus, every time we say a problem, I like to talk about, okay, well, what can we do about it? Because the good news about things like, I said we're in the middle of a sixth extinction and it's driven by humans, and Lou mentioned already climate change, and that's, driven by human activities and things like that. The good news about that is if we're the ones causing it, we're the ones who can do something about it. If it's just out of our control, that's when it gets scary. So let's talk about some of the threats that were mentioned, and we can talk about some of the solutions. One of the threats to reef is pollution. And we're going to go into more detail in a little bit about how runoff from the lands and from our homes, when we're not even on the beach, how that impacts the reefs. When we talk about pollution, there are two sorts of types of pollution that we'll mention, point source and non-point source. Has anyone heard of point source pollution before? Okay, the difference between point source and non-point source means essentially it's coming from one spot. So if you have a factory that's dumping its waste into the water, that's a point source of pollution. If we're talking about the oil that's dripping from all the cars on the road and then running off after it rains into the storm drains, that's non-point source, because it's not just one source, it's widespread and there's lots of different things. So obviously point source is easier to deal with than non-point source, but both are issues we need to talk about, and they're slightly different from one another. Just, you have like one factory producing pollution versus the little things all of us do every day that cause pollution. One of the results of runoff and pollution in the water is something called eutrophication. This is a word that was on your pre-test. Has anyone heard of eutrophication before? Eutrophication, it's from the Greek, meaning well-nourished. It basically just happens when you have excess nutrients in the water. And when you have a lot of nutrients in the water, then you have excess algal growth. And Lou mentioned one of the requirements of coral reefs is that they exist in low nutrient waters, right? So that there's plenty of sunlight for them, essentially. So there's no competition from algae and other things for the light that they need. What do you think is causing nutrients to be put in the water?
Farming. Farming.
Okay, yeah, so what about farming?
The runoff from the fertilizer.
Fertilizers. Yeah, and it's not just farming. How many people put fertilizers on their lawns?
Lawn services and their fertilizers.
Right. So it's a big problem that's, yes, farming, but also we have control over it in our own homes as well as to what we do. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the two big things that are leading to this. So if you ever buy a bag of fertilizer, there's an NPK ratio, and that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are like the big macronutrients. So what are some of the things that we can do about this? Well, we can reduce our fertilizer use. How can we reduce fertilizer use by farms? I'm not a farmer. Well, you can, yes?
I do a lot of gardening, and instead of buying the fertilizer in the market for my plants, I use leftover food skins and natural stuff like
Compost,
Excellent. Yeah. So in our own homes, we can compost. We can choose what we buy, right? So you can buy more organic foods, which would reduce fertilizer use. You can buy locally, maybe get to know some of the farms around to know where there's problems and the farmers that are doing well, and do that sort of thing. On our lawns, one of the ways that we can reduce the need for fertilizers in our own yards is by using native plants instead of planting grass, and instead of planting exotic tropical plants and things that need a lot of care, we can plant things that grow here naturally, and then we don't need to supplement them. We can try to manage our water runoff, because the problem is not just that these nutrients are there, but that they're running off into our water bodies. And that's something we'll talk about in a minute or after lunch when we get into the lesson planning. But there's lots of things that we can do about this. We can reduce the amount of permeable surfaces that we have, and this can be anything from ripping out your old parking lot at your school and putting in a permeable surface, or just simply trying to reduce the amount of paved surfaces that you have. by planting more vegetation, native vegetation. You can manage the runoff from your roof by installing rain barrels that will collect that water, and then that can be used to water your gardens. And you can install things that are called bioswales or rain gardens, which is, you know, the swales that usually just have grass in them, or the water pools after it rains. If we put like native wetland vegetation in there, plant that will help sort of manage that water. As the water collects in there, all that native vegetation will sort of slow the way that it flows, and give it more time to sort of percolate down into the groundwater. And by the process of it going through that vegetation and going through the ground, it will filter out a lot of things. So what can your students do? Some examples I have here: encourage their parents to plant natives at home, do school gardens where you teach about composting and things like that. What else can you guys do?
Well, show them pictures of what some of these systems look like, and have them go in a community scavenger hunt and identify them and see if they can tally how many rain barrels do they see, or how many swales or native plants. Learn to identify native plants and see how many neighbors are actually using native plants versus high maintenance plants. Just have them be aware of what's around them first, you know. To me, that would be I will start.
That's great.
Yeah.
And for native plants, there's lots of great resources. There's the Florida Native Plant Society, which are very, very active. There's an online resource called Natives for Your Neighborhood, where you can put in your zip code and it gives you a list of native plants for your area. So those are tools you can use in your classroom as well. Any other ideas of how we can talk about this with our students? Mm-hmm.
Even start by designing a small little, like let's say if you want to put all these improvements, have them do sort of like a problem-based learning project where they can actually sit down and negotiate to have X amounts of land and so much money to buy such amount of native plants, so much water that I can use during certain time, and bring it to tie up all of these, factors. Right. And of course this will be, just off the top of my head, making it to a more deeper project where they can apply and use what they know to kind of do a fictitious kind of model of what would be the best way to use your property. Right.
And maybe if the schools would let you could even install some rain barrels.
Yeah.
Different classes
and apply it to their own school ground. Yeah.
Cool. All right, another threat that Lou talked about, overfishing, and we'll talk about biodiversity loss as well. So this seems like a really, really big issue. I told you we're in the middle of a sixth mass extinction. This is from the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and we're losing tons of species from every different class. So it's a big problem, but what can we do? I'm not going out and killing the tigers. I'm not going out and harpooning whales. So what can I do? Well, we can eat sustainable seafoods, because in the oceans a big problem is fisheries aren't managed. It's impossible to do. So it's just not done. And so a lot of fish are being overfished. There's a lot of bycatch. There's a lot of other issues. Bycatch meaning that you're catching things that you're not looking for, and they get caught in your net and pulled up on your boat. They're dead. So we can eat sustainable seafood. One thing that we can do, the Monterey Bay Aquarium puts out Seafood Watch, seafoodwatch.org, and different places you can pick up these little wallet-sized booklets that I think they come out with a new one every year, and goes through just the major seafood that you'll probably find on your restaurant menus, in your grocery stores, and they're green, they're orange, or they're red, which is, okay, this is good, and it measures not just the sustainability of the fishery itself, but also things like toxin contents and mercury and things like that as well. So it tells you what's okay to eat, what maybe, maybe not, and then just what don't order it, don't eat it. Responsible aquarium practices. So we were asked about who grows the corals in the pet shops, and those are typically grown by private people growing them, but you want to make sure that you're not buying something that has been collected off the reef. exotic species like the lionfish are here because of aquariums. So if you're going to have an aquarium with exotic saltwater fish, make sure that you're not dumping them into a waterway or you know, letting them get escaped like that. One idea I had for students, there's an organization called Reef.org, and you can do like with the marine debris tracker, if you have a field trip and you're going out and doing any sort of snorkeling, your students can write down the fish they see and they can upload it on this website. So this is a great network, and people contribute to it from, you know, people who can identify 1 or 2 species to master divers who know everything and go out and do real formal surveys and can upload this information. And this is something called citizen science, which is the same thing as the marine debris tracker, where it's just one scientist or, you know, one organization can't fund doing surveys of every place all over the world. And so it depends on interested people to go out and collect these data and upload them and put them there. So that's one thing, if you have an opportunity to go do anything with your students, and it doesn't even need to be snorkeling, you can do, you know, seining even in the intercoastal, or just, you know, intertidal areas, whatever you can find and add to it is good. How else could you get your students involved in this, do you think? What else can you in your classroom with your students do to help with overfishing and biodiversity? Yeah.
Well, not that, just backtracking just a step. On the last one that you had, you were just back there talking about how we can actually, instead of the rain barrels, we can actually get the kids to bring in the old coffee cans that the parents use, or the coffee canisters that they use, and they can decorate and line it up along the school to see how much rain they can actually catch, and they can even use the old coffee grinds as a fertilizer for the plants in the garden at the school.
Yeah, that'd be a great exercise for them to even just see how much water comes off the roof.
Yes,
too.
and that'll get them involved in it, so.
Right. Very cool.
Very good.
So another threat that Lou introduced was physical damage. So I'm sure when you take your kids down to the Keys, one of the first lessons they get is don't touch the reef. You know, watch what your fins are doing. Don't stand on the coral. And so that's just something that we as individuals can do, is when we're in the water, we can just be mindful of that.